There is a decision you make every single night, and you have never once noticed yourself making it. It is not what you eat before bed. It is not the hour you turn off the light. It is not how many hours you manage to stay asleep. It is the last thing your mind is holding in the final minutes before you disappear. The room has gone dark. The day is finished. Your body has stopped moving. But something inside you has not stopped yet. It is still turning something over, still finishing a sentence you did not finish out loud, still standing in a conversation that ended hours ago. Carl Jung spent his life studying that narrow strip of time between being awake and being gone. He reached a conclusion that sounds strange the first time you hear it. He believed those few minutes are the only moments in a person's entire day when they cannot lie to themselves. Not because you become wiser at night, but because you become too tired to keep pretending. And whatever is present in you when you cross that line does not stay behind. It goes with you. It sinks into a layer of the mind that does not sleep, that does not judge, and that does not forget. And it is waiting for you in the morning, wearing the face of your ordinary life. If you cross that line carrying resentment, you wake up in a world that seems to deserve resentment. If you cross it carrying urgency, you wake up already behind. If you cross it carrying the quiet belief that you are not enough, you will meet 100 small pieces of evidence for that belief before lunch. You will not call it a pattern, you will call it your life. So the question is very simple, and almost nobody asks it. What should be in your mind in those last few minutes, so that you stop waking up as the same person, in the same life, carrying the same weight you have carried for years? Stay with this until the end. What we are going to look at is small enough that you can do it tonight, and large enough that it changes the direction of the next 10 years, the hour when you stop defending yourself. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with the body. You can sleep 8 hours and still wake up carrying it. You can take a holiday and feel it follow you onto the plane. It is not the tiredness of doing too much. It is the tiredness of being someone all day long. Because from the moment you open your eyes, you begin holding a shape. You become the reliable one, or the calm one, or the funny one, or the one who never complains. You answer the message in the tone that is expected. You give the version of the answer that keeps the conversation comfortable. You put a small distance between what you feel and what you show, and you keep that distance steady for 16 hours. Nobody teaches you to do this. You learned it early, and you learned it well. Jung had a name for that shape. He called it the persona, borrowing the word for the mask worn by actors in ancient theater. And he was careful to say, the persona is not a lie, it is not hypocrisy, and it is not weakness. It is a necessary interface between an inner world and an outer one. Without it, you could not work, could not negotiate, could not sit through a difficult meal with people you love and disagree with. The persona is what allows a private life to move through a public world. The problem is never that you have one. The problem is that it does not have an off switch, which is why it stays on through the commute, and through dinner, and through the conversation where someone asks how you are, and you answer before the question has finished. It stays on so continuously that after a certain number of years, you stop being able to tell where the mask ends, and you begin. Until the room goes dark, watch what happens in those minutes. The day is over. There is no one left to reassure, and no task left to manage. And for the first time since morning, there is no reason to hold the shape. So it drops. And in the space it leaves behind, something else comes forward. Not dramatically, not as a revelation. Usually it arrives as a feeling, with no name attached. A kind of low weather that was not there 5 minutes ago. A heaviness, an unexplained restlessness, a sadness that has nothing obvious to attach itself to. Most people meet that feeling and immediately assume something has gone wrong. Nothing has gone wrong. What has happened is that you stopped defending yourself, and the part of you that has been waiting all day finally has room to stand up. Jung wrote a sentence that describes this more precisely than anything written since. In each of us, there is another whom we do not know. He did not mean a hidden enemy. He did not mean a secret self waiting to ruin your life. He meant that a human being is larger than the portion of themselves they are permitted to be during working hours. There is always a remainder. And the remainder does not go away simply because there was no space for it in the schedule. At night, the schedule ends, and the remainder comes to the door. Consider what a stage looks like after the audience has left. During the performance, the lights are arranged so that you see exactly what you are meant to see. The set looks solid. The room looks like a room. But when the audience is gone and the working light comes on, you see the scaffolding behind the walls, the tape on the floor, the ropes, the ordinary wood holding up the illusion. No secret has been revealed. You are simply seeing the whole thing instead of the arranged part of it. That is the moment before sleep. Not a collapse, a working light. Modern sleep research has a name for this strip of time. It is called the hypnagogic state, the transition between waking and sleep, and it behaves unlike any other part of the day. Attention loosens, logical control weakens, images begin arriving on their own without being summoned. Thoughts stop obeying the order you would normally impose on them. Researchers describe it as a state in which the mind becomes unusually associative and unusually honest, because the part of you that edits has gone quiet before the one that speaks. Working a century earlier, without the equipment, Jung reached the same conclusion. He simply paid attention. Here is what makes this the foundation of everything that follows. Most people experience the hypnagogic hour as an interruption. They lie down, the mask drops, an uncomfortable feeling arrives, and they immediately reach for something to make it stop. The phone, the screen, the second episode. Anything that will put the shape back on for another 40 minutes until exhaustion finally does the job that honesty was going to do anyway. Night after night, they fall asleep having successfully avoided the one conversation the day was building toward. Nothing is lost by this, and that is the difficult part. No dramatic loss occurs at all. You simply stay the same, and staying the same is not a punishment. It is just what happens when nothing is ever allowed to reach you. There is a version of this that is worth understanding clearly. A person can spend 20 years improving their circumstances and not one single hour becoming known to themselves. They change jobs, cities, partners, routines, and every night the same mask comes off, the same unnamed feeling arrives, and the same distraction arrives 4 seconds later to send it away. From the outside, the life has moved a great distance. From the inside, nothing has been visited. Jung believed the persona was the first thing a person has to see through, not because it is bad, but because you cannot begin an inner life while you are still convinced that the outer arrangement is all there is. You cannot see through it during the day. During the day, you need it. Which is why the hour before sleep is not a small technical detail about rest. It is structurally the only appointment your inner life gets. It is the 1 hour when the defense is down, the performance is over, and the piece of you that never gets a turn to speak finally has the space. What you do with that hour is what decides whether you are a person who is living or a person who is being lived. So the practice here is smaller than you expect. You are not asked to solve anything. You are not asked to meditate correctly or breathe in a particular pattern or achieve calm. You are asked to do one thing only. When you lie down tonight and the shape drops and the discomfort comes forward, do not reach for the phone for 60 seconds. Just 60. Stay there and let the feeling be in the room with you without being named, fixed, or argued with. What happens next surprises almost everyone. It will not get worse. That is what everyone fears, and it is almost never what happens. Feelings do not intensify when they are witnessed. They intensify when they are ignored, because the only way an unheard thing can raise its voice is by getting louder. The mask is not your enemy. It is your uniform, and you have worn it well, and you have worn it for a very long time. But no one becomes whole in uniform, and the hour when you finally take it off is not the end of your day. It is the only part of it that was ever fully yours. The question your mind has already been asking you. Once the mask is off, and you have stayed in the room for those first 60 seconds, you begin to notice that the feeling arriving each night is not random. It is specific. It has a shape, and it is the same shape it had last night. Most people never discover this because they do not stay long enough to see the repetition. They meet the feeling, label it as tiredness or stress, and move on. But if you stay with it for even a handful of nights, one thing becomes very clear. You are not being visited by a mood. You are being asked a question. And you have been asked it for a long time. Jung called these recurring inner knots complexes. The word has been worn thin by casual use, so it is worth restoring its actual meaning. A complex is a cluster of memory, feeling, and belief that has organized itself around a single wound or a single unresolved theme, and it operates with a strange kind of autonomy. It is not something you have. It is something that has you at certain moments, in certain rooms, with certain people. You can recognize a complex by its behavior. It is disproportionate. A comment that should be minor takes your whole evening. A tone of voice from someone you barely know puts you somewhere you have been before. You watch yourself react, and a distant part of you says quietly, "This is more than the situation deserves." That gap between the size of the event and the size of the reaction is the fingerprint of something older being touched. And at night, when the ego stops arranging things, the complex is what surfaces. It does not surface as an argument. It surfaces as a question with no words in it. Am I actually respected here? Is this the life I chose or the life I fell into? Why did I not say the thing I meant to say? Is anyone going to come? What am I doing? You do not consciously ask these things. They ask themselves in the form of an ache. Jung wrote a line about this that most people misread as pessimism, when it is actually one of the most freeing things he ever said. The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. Read that carefully, because the usual response to a recurring inner question is to try to answer it, defeat it, or reason it out of existence. And every one of those approaches fails, which is why the question keeps coming back, and why people conclude they are broken. You are not failing to solve it. It was never the kind of thing that gets solved. Jung observed that when patients finally moved past a problem that had held them for years, they could rarely say how. They had not found a solution. They had grown to a size where the problem was no longer the center of the map. The question did not get answered. It got outgrown, the way a room you were afraid of as a child becomes just a room. But nothing gets outgrown while it is being avoided. Growth requires contact. Picture an unopened letter. It arrives on a Tuesday, and you recognize the handwriting, and you know roughly what it is about, and you are not ready. So you put it under a book, and in the morning you move it to the kitchen counter and later to the drawer, and eventually to a box in a cupboard where you no longer have to see it. That letter is now invisible. It is also still entirely unread. Here is what people miss about that cupboard. It costs energy to keep a door shut. Every day that the letter is in there, a very small amount of your attention is committed to not thinking about it. You never feel that cost directly. You feel it as a general tiredness you cannot explain, as a difficulty concentrating, as the sense that you are carrying something even when your hands are empty. The unopened letter is not free. It has been charging you interest for years. At night, the cupboard opens on its own, not because you decided to open it, but because whatever has been holding it shut has finally run out of energy for the day. That is what the feeling is. That is why it always comes at the same hour. I spoke once with a woman who had run the same department for 11 years and was regarded by everyone, including herself, as unusually capable. She described her nights with an accuracy that surprised her as she said it. Every evening, in the last few minutes before sleep, she would find herself reviewing the day for mistakes, not important ones. She would replay a sentence she had said in a meeting and consider whether it had sounded arrogant. She would revisit an email and wonder whether the tone had been cold. She had done this every night for over a decade. She had never once described it to another person, because it did not seem like anything. It seemed like being conscientious. What she had not noticed was that she was not reviewing the day. She was standing trial for it. Every night, she quietly gathered evidence against herself, delivered a verdict, and fell asleep as the accused. Every morning, she woke up in the life of a person who had already been found slightly guilty. It did not make her miserable. It made her careful and tense and unable to enjoy anything she achieved, because the achievement was always being measured against a charge she had never named. The question underneath was not about the meeting. It was much older and much simpler, and it had been waiting to be asked since long before she had a department. It was this: am I allowed to be enough as I am? She had been answering it every night for 11 years, in the negative, without ever once hearing the question. This is the difference between having a bad night and having a pattern. A bad night is a response to something that happened. A pattern is a response to something that has not been looked at. Nothing mystical explains why night is where this becomes visible. The reason is structural. During the day, there is always a more urgent claim on you. There is always a task, a person, a screen, a reason to postpone. At night, for the first time in 18 hours, nothing is more urgent. And the question, which has been standing patiently at the back of the queue since you were young, finally reaches the front. Jung's position on this was consistent throughout his life. He did not believe the goal was to make it go away. He believed the goal was to hear it correctly. Because a question you have not heard runs your life from behind. A question you have heard becomes something you can live in relationship with. Notice that the woman did not need to solve whether she was enough. That is not solvable, and every attempt to solve it by achievement had failed for 11 years, which is exactly what Jung would have predicted. What she needed was to hear that this was the question. From the moment she could say it plainly to herself, the nightly trial lost most of its authority. Not because she had won the case, because she finally understood there had been a case running at all. So tonight, when the feeling arrives, do the opposite of analyzing it. Do not ask what is wrong with me. It has never once produced a useful answer in the history of anyone. Ask instead, very quietly, what is this feeling asking me? A reply may not come immediately. It may take several nights. It may arrive sideways, in the middle of a Wednesday, in the middle of an unrelated task. That is normal. The unconscious does not answer on schedule, and it does not answer in the room where it was asked. But a shift will have taken place, and it will be permanent. You will have stopped treating a message as a symptom. The feeling that visits you at night is not an intruder. It is the one piece of you that has kept asking the real question while the rest of you got on with the day. And it will keep asking, every night, patiently, until someone finally listens. What you rehearse at night, you become by morning. Hearing the question, rather than merely suffering it, opens onto a harder truth. The mind does not only receive what you bring to it at night, it practices it. This is the part that most people have never been told, and it explains how a life can stay in the same shape for decades while the person inside it tries very hard to change. Because effort during the day is not what builds a self. Repetition at the threshold is. Jung understood the unconscious as something that learns, but not in the way consciousness learns. Consciousness learns by understanding. The unconscious learns by familiarity. It does not ask whether a state is good for you. It does not ask whether the state is even true. It asks one question only, and it asks it every single night. Is this what we usually do? If the answer is yes, it makes the necessary arrangements. There is a piece of sleep research that demonstrates this so cleanly that it has become famous. In a set of studies at Harvard, participants were asked to play a simple falling block puzzle game for several hours across several days. When researchers woke them during the earliest stage of sleep and asked what was in their minds, the great majority reported the same thing: blocks. falling, rotating, fitting into gaps. The detail that matters most is this. The effect appeared even in participants with severe amnesia, people who could not remember having played the game at all, and could not recognize the researchers from one day to the next. They had no memory of the experience. And still, at the edge of sleep, the shapes were falling. A mind was rehearsing something its owner did not know it had learned. This is now understood as part of how sleep consolidates experience. The brain replays the patterns it has been running, strengthens the connections those patterns use, and prepares them for tomorrow. It is an extraordinarily efficient system, and it is completely indifferent to your preferences. It does not replay what you wanted to do. It replays what you did. In the final minutes before sleep, you are handing it the material. So consider honestly what most people rehearse. They rehearse the argument they lost. They rehearse the sentence they should have said, refined now into something devastating that will never be delivered. They rehearse the worry about money, walking the same 3 steps of the same imagined disaster. They rehearse the scroll, which is a rehearsal of comparison. They rehearse the account of everything that did not get finished. Night after night, for years, with more consistency than they bring to anything else in their lives. Then they wonder why the same feeling meets them at 7 in the morning. Jung's most quoted sentence is about exactly this mechanism, though it is usually read as if it were about self-knowledge in general. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Notice the word doing the work there, fate, because that is precisely how it presents itself. It does not feel like a habit. Habits feel like habits. This feels like the weather, like circumstance, like the way things happen to be for you specifically. It feels like a truth about your life rather than a groove worn into it. That is not a coincidence. It is what a pattern feels like from the inside. Walk across a lawn once, and nothing happens. Walk across it every day, and eventually there is a path. Nobody planned the path. No committee approved it. It appeared because of repetition, and now everyone who crosses that lawn uses it, including people who have never crossed it before, because it is visibly the way across. Nobody decides to use the path. The path is simply where walking is easy. Your nightly state is the walking. Your morning is the path. This explains one of the most frustrating facts about self-improvement. You can adopt a new goal, a new routine, a new philosophy, a new plan, all of it sincere, all of it during daylight, and still find yourself back in the same emotional position within a fortnight. Not through weakness, through arithmetic. You spent 1 hour on the new intention. You spent 7 hours rehearsing the old one. The unconscious does not weigh your sincerity, it weighs your hours. There is a physiological echo of this in the morning. Within roughly half an hour of waking, the body produces a sharp rise in cortisol, a response that prepares a person to meet the coming day. That rise is not neutral in size. It is measurably influenced by anticipated demand and by chronic stress. In other words, the body begins tomorrow by preparing for the day it expects, and it forms that expectation from the days it has been having. You do not wake up and then feel a certain way. You wake up already equipped for a specific kind of day, which is why the intervention has to happen before sleep and not after waking. By morning, the preparation is complete. You are not choosing a mood at 7. You are receiving a delivery that was ordered the night before. None of this means you must fall asleep in a pleasant state. That misunderstanding ruins the whole practice, and it is where most people fail. Jung had no interest in forced positivity. He regarded it as one of the least honest things a person could do to themselves, and he believed a suppressed state does not stop operating. It merely stops being visible. If you go to bed furious and instruct yourself to feel gratitude, you have not changed the material. You have added a second layer of pretending on top of it, and the unconscious registers both. What changes is not the content of the state. It is your relationship to it. There is an enormous difference between falling asleep inside anger and falling asleep aware of anger. In the first, you are the anger. and the anger is quietly rehearsed as your identity. In the second, there is a small space between you and it, and the unconscious registers that space too. It registers that this was witnessed. It registers that there was someone present. That gap is the entire mechanism. It is not large, and it is not dramatic, and it does not seem like anything much on the first night. But it is the difference between practicing a state and observing one. So the practice for this section is deliberately unimpressive. Before sleep, name what you have been rehearsing. Not what you feel, but what you have been running. Say it plainly and without editing. Tonight, I have been rehearsing the argument. Tonight, I have been rehearsing the shortfall. Tonight, I have been rehearsing the scroll. That single sentence will not stop the rehearsal on the first night. It is not meant to. It is meant to insert a witness into a process that has been running unobserved for years. An unobserved process and an observed one are two different processes, even when they contain the same material. Jung believed that consciousness is not a spectator. He believed that the act of becoming aware of something changes what that something is able to do to you, not by force, by presence. What you rehearse at night, you become by morning. So it is worth knowing, with some precision, what you have been practicing. If something here has named a state you recognize, put it in the comments. It might be one sentence. It might be the thing you have rehearsed every night for years, without ever calling it that. You will find you are not the only one, and someone reading it at 2 in the morning may find the words for what they have carried alone and unnamed. What is spoken stops being a private burden and starts being a place other people can stand. The night sea journey. Stop distracting yourself. Notice what you have been practicing. Do both, and you arrive somewhere that no amount of preparation makes comfortable. The dark. Not metaphorical dark, not a mood. The specific experience of lying still, with nothing to look at, and discovering that you are not alone in your own mind. Things arrive. Old humiliations arrive with the clarity of yesterday. Cruelties you committed years ago and had successfully filed away arrive fully formed. Grief you thought had finished its work arrives without warning and without occasion. Desires you would not say aloud arrive and stand there, unembarrassed. Almost everyone concludes, at that point, that a mistake has been made. It has not. Understand this clearly, because everything after it depends on getting this one point right. The darkness does not appear because you have made a mistake. It appears because you have finally stopped moving. Jung called this territory the shadow, and the term has been so thoroughly misunderstood that it is worth stating precisely what he meant. The shadow is not evil, it is not a demon, and it is not the worst version of you waiting for an opening. The shadow is simply everything about yourself that has been refused entry into consciousness, because it did not fit the picture you needed to hold. Some of it is what you would expect. Envy, spite, the pleasure you felt when someone who deserved it failed, rage that has never had anywhere to go. But a great deal of the shadow is not dark at all. Jung was insistent on this, and almost nobody quotes him on it. Enormous amounts of a person's ability, appetite, tenderness, and force end up in the shadow, because those qualities were dangerous to display in the family or the culture they grew up in. Ambition, in a household where you were required to be modest. Grief, in a household where you were required to be strong. Softness, in a household where softness got you hurt. Those parts did not die. They were sent downstairs. All of it is still down there, in the dark, undiminished, waiting. Jung's sentence about this is the most important thing he wrote about the process you are being asked to enter. The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. Look at the two words carrying that sentence. At first. He is not describing a destination. He is describing an entrance. Everyone who goes inward meets this first, and many people meet it, decide they have taken a wrong turn, and go back upstairs for another 20 years. The dark is not the wrong room, it is the corridor. Jung had a name for the passage itself, borrowed from mythology, and it is the reason this section exists. He called it the night sea journey. He noticed that the same story appears across cultures that could not possibly have borrowed it from one another. The hero is swallowed. Jonah goes into the whale. Osiris is dismembered and carried by the river. The sun sinks into the western sea each evening and travels, all night, beneath the world, through the belly of something enormous, before it can rise in the east. Notice what the myth insists upon, because it is very specific, and it is the opposite of what we have been taught to want. The sun does not go around the dark. It does not find a shortcut over the top. It does not defeat the dark with more light. It goes through it, and it takes all night, and there is no other route. And it does not come back as the same sun. It comes back as the morning. This pattern, Jung believed, was not a story humanity invented. He believed it was a description of what actually happens to people, told in the only language available before psychology existed. Every real transformation in a human life has this structure. Something ends. There is a period of descent that feels like nothing but loss. And what comes out the other side is not the old self repaired. It is a larger self that could not have existed without the passage, which means the dark is not an obstacle in the journey. It is the journey. There is a way to picture this that removes some of the fear. Imagine going down into the cellar of a house you have lived in for 30 years, carrying a candle, having never been down there before. Your candle shows you shelves. It shows you boxes with your own handwriting on them. It shows you objects you do not remember owning, and objects you remember owning and had decided you had lost. Not one object in that cellar arrived tonight. Every single thing has been directly beneath your feet for 3 decades, holding the house up, while you lived on the floor above and told people about the house. That candle did not create the cellar. It only means you are finally in it. One more thing about that cellar changes how it feels. It is not a separate building, it is the foundation. The rooms you love are standing on it. Modern neuroscience has a partial parallel here, and it is worth noting without overstating it. When external attention drops away, a network of brain regions associated with self-referential thought becomes more active. What it processes in that state is not evenly selected. It preferentially returns to the unresolved, the socially uncertain, the unfinished. The mind, left alone, goes looking for what has not been settled. That is not a design flaw. A system that ignored unresolved things would never resolve anything, which reframes the entire experience of a difficult night. You are not malfunctioning at 2 in the morning. You are running the only process available for finishing things. Now, the crucial distinction, and Jung was uncompromising about it. Facing the shadow does not mean excavating it. He had no time for people who tried to force their way into the unconscious, and he considered deliberate self-tormenting to be its own kind of ego project, a way of appearing to do inner work while actually performing it. You are not being asked to go looking for the worst thing about yourself tonight. What is being asked is that you stop leaving the room when it arrives on its own. That is all. The shadow does not need to be hunted. It arrives every night, punctually, the moment the distractions stop. The entire task is to remain. What you do when it arrives is smaller than you would think. You do not argue with it. You do not explain it. You do not immediately try to trace it to its origin in your childhood, because that is analysis, and analysis at midnight is usually just a more sophisticated way of running. You say one thing, silently, and you mean it. This is also me. Not this is acceptable. Not this is good. Not this is who I want to be. Only this belongs to the same person as everything else, and I am not going to pretend it lives somewhere else. Jung believed that what is denied does not become smaller. It becomes autonomous. A part of yourself that is refused acknowledgement does not stop having force. It loses only its ability to be negotiated with. It goes on operating from underneath, choosing your reactions before you know a choice has been made, showing up as the thing you do that you cannot explain and did not intend. Your shadow does not want to destroy your life. It wants to come upstairs. And the moment before sleep, when everything has finally slowed down, is when it knocks. One kind of person needs this section more than anyone, and they will not recognize themselves easily, because they are usually described as strong. They cope, they handle things. They are the one everybody calls. They have not cried in years, and they say this without any sense that it is unusual. For that person, the night is loud. Not because they are weak, but because the amount they have sent downstairs is enormous, and the pressure of holding a door shut is proportional to what is behind it. If your nights are difficult, it is not evidence of fragility. It is very often evidence of how much you have been carrying without permission to feel it. So tonight, if the dark comes forward, try staying 30 seconds longer than is comfortable. Not an hour, 30 seconds. You are not being asked to like what appears. You are being asked to stop treating a part of yourself as an intruder in its own house. Because as Jung understood, and as every myth of descent has been trying to say for 4,000 years, nobody has ever become whole by staying in the light. The sun does not skip the sea. It goes down, and it goes through, and it comes back as morning. Everything you did not finish becomes tomorrow's weather. One category of thing comes up in the dark more often than any other, and it deserves its own section because it accounts for more disturbed nights than anything else in human life. The unfinished, not unfinished work, unfinished feeling. The conversation that stopped without concluding, the apology that was never offered and never demanded, the person who left before it was resolved, the version of an event that you have gone over 400 times, in which you finally say the thing, and they finally understand, and it finally lands. You are not remembering when you do this. You are attempting to complete something. The attempt never succeeds, which is why it returns every night. Jung observed that the psyche has very little tolerance for open loops, and almost none for open emotional ones. A situation that has ended in fact but not in feeling continues to occupy the system as though it were live. The other person may have moved country. They may have died. The organization may no longer exist. It makes no difference to the part of you still standing in that room, because the unconscious does not process time the way a calendar does. It processes completion. What has not been closed is, for the unconscious, still happening. Here is where it becomes consequential rather than merely uncomfortable. Because what does not get finished does not simply sit there quietly. It goes looking for somewhere to happen. Jung called this projection, and it is one of the most useful ideas ever produced about human relationships. What we cannot hold consciously in ourselves, we perceive with great vividness in other people, not deliberately, not as a lie, as an actual experience. The quality genuinely appears to be over there. His sentence on this is unusually direct. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. He is not saying that other people are never difficult. Some people are extremely difficult, and Jung, who spent decades listening to human beings describe each other, was under no illusions about that. His point is more precise than that. He is saying that the intensity of your reaction is information about you, and only the content of it is information about them. You can identify a projection by its temperature. Ordinary annoyance is proportionate, and it passes. Projection burns. It produces a reaction out of scale with the event. It makes you eloquent, and it stays with you for hours afterward, composing. That heat is not coming from them. They lit it, but they did not build it. Imagine sitting in a dark room watching a scene unfold on a wall. The scene is completely convincing. There are faces and movement, and you have opinions about the people you are watching, and your body responds to what they do. Every single thing on that wall is coming from a small machine behind your own head. The wall is not lying to you. What you are seeing is really there, on the wall. It simply did not originate there. This is what an unfinished feeling does at night. Having nowhere to complete itself, it finds a screen. A colleague becomes the parent who never approved. A partner's silence becomes a silence from 30 years earlier. A stranger's tone opens a door you did not know was in the room, and you go to sleep certain that you are upset about today. There is an old story that describes this better than any explanation. Jacob, traveling alone, is left by a river at night, and a figure comes out of the dark and wrestles with him. There is no explanation given. The fight is not brief, and it is not won. It lasts the entire night, until the first light, and Jacob is injured in it, permanently, in the hip. And at dawn, the figure tries to leave, and Jacob, wounded and exhausted, says the strangest line in the story. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." He does not ask to win. He does not ask for it to have not happened. He asks the thing that has been fighting him all night to give him something before it goes. And it does. It gives him a new name. He does not leave the river the way he arrived. He leaves limping and renamed. Whatever you believe about where that story came from, notice its structure, because it is exact. The struggle happens at night. It happens alone. It cannot be avoided, and it cannot be quickly won. It leaves a permanent mark. And the blessing is not separate from the wound. It comes from refusing to release the thing until it yields something. Most people do the opposite. They release it at 3 in the morning by finding a distraction, and they receive nothing, and it returns the following night to begin again. Jung's version of this was less dramatic and no less demanding. We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. Most readers take that sentence as advice about tolerance. It is not. It is a technical statement about how psychological material behaves. As long as you are condemning something, whether in yourself or in another person, you are locked into a relationship with it. Condemnation is not distance. Condemnation is a form of holding on, and it takes exactly as much energy as any other form of holding on. Which means the nightly courtroom is not resolving anything. It is maintaining the case. So what does finishing actually look like, given that the other person is not available, may not be alive, and would probably not say the line you need to hear, even if they were? It looks like this, and it is much smaller than the imagined conversation. You finish it on your side. Let yourself want, explicitly and without embarrassment, what you did not get. Not the argument, the thing underneath the argument. You wanted to be believed. You wanted someone to notice how hard it had been. You wanted to be chosen first, once. You wanted to be told it was not your fault. Most people have never once let themselves state this plainly, because it feels childish, and because saying it aloud admits that it did not happen. That admission is the whole of the work. Not forgiveness, which cannot be manufactured and should never be forced. Not understanding their side, which is often possible later, but rarely at midnight. Just the naming of what was wanted and not received. Because a wish that is finally acknowledged stops needing a screen to appear on. This does not resolve on the first night. It resolves the way water finds a level, over an unspecified number of nights, and it usually becomes apparent to you only in retrospect, when you notice that someone who used to reliably infuriate you has become merely a person you find tiring. That is what a closed loop feels like, not triumph, reduction in temperature. Every loop you close is one less thing your unconscious has to carry into tomorrow and paint onto somebody's face. Because whatever does not get finished at night does not stay at night. It becomes the weather you wake up in, and then it becomes the lens you look through, and then, if it is left long enough, it becomes what you sincerely believe other people are like. If any part of this has been describing a state you recognize, send it to the person you thought of while you were listening. You do not need to add a message. Some things do not need to be explained, only arrived at the right hour. Someone is lying awake tonight rehearsing a conversation that ended years ago, and they have never once been told that this is a thing that happens to people. The part of you that is already trying to correct the course. Everything so far has described what surfaces at night, and why it surfaces, and what happens when it is refused. Now the direction reverses. Because there is an assumption underneath most of what people believe about their inner life. and it is wrong, and correcting it changes the entire relationship. The assumption is that the unconscious is a container, a basement, a place where things are stored and from which unpleasant things occasionally leak. Jung did not think that at all. He thought the unconscious was doing something, continuously, on your behalf, whether or not you cooperate. He called it compensation, and it was central to everything he believed about dreams and about the night. Here is the idea. Consciousness is necessarily one-sided. It has to be. To function at all, you have to select, emphasize, ignore, and commit. A person who held every possibility in view at once could not cross a road. So you develop a position, and you live from it, and over time that position becomes narrower without your noticing, because every day you use it, it gets more worn in. Watching that narrowing, according to Jung, the unconscious produces the counterweight. Not to torment you, to keep you upright. This is why the person who has been relentlessly strong dreams of collapsing, and the person who has been relentlessly careful dreams of wrecking what they built, and the person who has been endlessly, exhaustingly agreeable dreams of shouting in a public place. The dream is not a wish, and it is not a warning. It is a correction to a lean that has become dangerous. The psyche behaves like a body that is losing its balance. It does not deliberate. It puts out a hand. There is a useful comparison in physical illness. A fever feels like the disease. It is uncomfortable, it is disorienting, it arrives without permission, and the immediate instinct is to make it stop. But the fever is not the illness. The fever is the response to the illness. It is the body raising its own temperature because the thing attacking it cannot survive the heat. The unpleasantness is the treatment working. An enormous number of difficult nights are fevers, the restlessness that arrives after a period of over-control, the sudden grief that surfaces months after the event when everything had apparently been handled well, the inexplicable resistance that appears just as you were about to commit to a course everyone agrees is sensible. None of that is malfunction. That is a system that has detected a lean and is putting out a hand. Jung's clinical position followed from this, and it separated him decisively from most of his contemporaries. He did not treat the unconscious as an adversary to be managed, drained, or defeated. He treated it as the larger part of a person, containing not only what had been rejected, but what had never yet been lived. He wrote that man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious, and he chose that verb deliberately. They press upward. They are not lying inert. They are trying to arrive. Sleep research has slowly circled the same territory from another direction. During certain phases of sleep, the brain reprocesses emotionally charged memories in a distinctive chemical environment, one in which the memory is reactivated while the stress signaling that originally accompanied it is substantially reduced. The leading interpretation is that this allows the content of an experience to be retained while the raw physiological charge attached to it is gradually dialed down, which means that a considerable part of what heals a person is not something they do. It is something that happens while they are unconscious, provided they get there. It also means that a night spent in avoidance is not neutral. If you fall asleep having successfully prevented anything from surfacing, you have not protected yourself. You have declined an appointment. I once spent an evening talking with a man whose father had died 2 years earlier after a relationship that had never worked and had never been discussed. He was functioning well. He had handled the estate, supported his mother, returned to work quickly, and been widely admired for how he had coped. Every night, without deciding to, he argued with his father. Full conversations, extremely articulate, in which he finally laid out, in order, every failure of the man's attention across 38 years. He said he had rehearsed some of these speeches so many times that he knew the pauses. Then one night he dreamed. His father was sitting in the passenger seat of a car, in the dark, not driving, not speaking, not defending himself, just present and looking straight ahead and waiting. That was the entire dream. Nothing was said. He woke up and wept for the first time in 2 years and did not know why. He kept trying to interpret it as a message from his father. That is not what Jung would have said, and it is not, in the end, what mattered. What mattered is what the dream was correcting. For 2 years, his conscious mind had held one position with total consistency. There is a case, and it must be argued. And every night he had argued it, to an empty chair, with nobody available to concede. The unconscious did not contradict the case. It never said the father had been good. It did something far more precise. It removed the argument and left the man. It gave him the one thing his conscious position had made impossible for 2 years. A version of his father that he could simply be in a car with. He had been trying to win. What he wanted was to sit down. That is compensation. Not comfort, not fantasy, not a message from beyond. A counterweight, delivered at night, aimed exactly at the place where his conscious attitude had become too narrow to let him grieve. Notice that he did not produce it. He could not have. 2 years of daytime effort had produced only better arguments. The correction came from a part of him that had been working on the problem the entire time, from underneath, using different material. This changes what the last minutes before sleep are for. If the unconscious is only a basement, then the sensible strategy is to keep the door shut and get to sleep as fast as possible. But if the unconscious is at work, actively restoring a balance you have lost, then those final minutes are not a risk to be managed. They are a handover. You can affect the quality of that handover, not by controlling what happens next, but by what you hand over, which is why the practice for this section is a sentence rather than a technique. Before you sleep, say plainly what you are actually carrying, not the polished version, the real one. I am carrying anger that has nowhere to go. I am carrying the fear that I have made an irreversible mistake. I am carrying missing someone. Then add the part that almost nobody says, and that changes the character of the whole thing. I am not going to solve this tonight. That is not resignation. It is an accurate description of the situation, and it is also permission, because as long as you are trying to solve it, consciousness stays in charge of the problem, and consciousness has already demonstrated that it is holding a position too narrow to fix this. Handing something over is not giving up on it. It is admitting that a larger part of you has been working on it all along and has better tools and works at night. Jung believed the most important shift a person can make is from fighting the unconscious to cooperating with it. You are not alone in there. Something in you has been trying to correct the course this entire time. All it has ever needed from you is that you stop steering long enough for it to reach the wheel. If this has been useful, a like genuinely helps it reach the people who are awake at this hour and looking for exactly this. And subscribe before you go, because there are 2 sections left, and the next one is the practical one. It is the answer to the question the title asked, the one thing to carry across the threshold. We have arrived at the question the whole video was built toward. If the last minutes before sleep are a handover, and if what you hand over is rehearsed, strengthened, and returned to you as tomorrow, then one practical matter is unavoidable. What, specifically, should be in your mind? Anyone hoping for an affirmation will be disappointed. Anyone who has ever tried one and felt like a fraud will be relieved. It is not a statement, it is a question. There is a reason for that, and it goes to the center of how Jung understood the mind. A statement is addressed to consciousness. A question is addressed to everything else. When you tell yourself that everything is fine, you are speaking in the language of the ego, and you are speaking to a part of yourself that already knows whether it is true. If it is not true, the statement does not become true. It becomes a second thing to manage. Now you have the original feeling, and you have the discomfort of having lied to yourself about it, and the unconscious has registered both with perfect accuracy. Jung watched this fail for decades. His conclusion was consistent. You cannot install a state you do not have. You can only become honest about the one you do, but a question behaves entirely differently. Asking opens rather than closes. It does not require you to already know, and critically, it can be left open overnight, which means it goes across the threshold with you and continues working in a place your conscious mind cannot follow. This is a miniature version of what Jung called active imagination, the practice of deliberately putting a conscious question to the unconscious and then, unusually, waiting for a reply rather than supplying one. His most quoted line on the whole subject is really an instruction about direction. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. That reads as poetry. It is closer to a procedure. So here is the question, and it is the thing to carry across the threshold tonight. What did I actually feel today that I did not have time to feel? Read it again, because the wording is doing precise work and almost every other version fails. It does not ask what went wrong, which produces a list and a verdict. It does not ask what you are grateful for, which is a fine practice, but is a statement wearing a question mark, and which most people use to skip past the very thing that needed attention. It does not ask what you should do tomorrow, which activates planning, which is the ego putting the uniform back on at exactly the wrong hour. What it asks is what you felt and did not have room to feel, which is an admission, built into the grammar, that there was something. There always was. No day passes without several moments a person moves through too quickly. A piece of news received in a corridor. A look on someone's face that you registered and did not have 30 seconds to consider. A moment of relief so brief you did not name it. A disappointment you decided was not worth being disappointed about. Those moments did not vanish because you were busy. They queued. And the night is when the queue is finally at the front. Here is what the process actually looks like, so that you know it is working when it does not feel like anything. You lie down, you ask the question, and in most cases, nothing arrives immediately. There may be 20 or 30 seconds of nothing at all, which is where the majority of people conclude that the practice does not work for them and reach for the phone. Stay past the nothing. The nothing is not failure. It is the pause between asking and being answered, and it exists because you have spent the entire day being the one who supplies the answers. Then it arrives, usually small and usually not what you expected. A specific moment, in a specific room, a sentence someone said, the way you felt walking back to your desk. Do not analyze it. This is the discipline of the whole practice, and it is the part people get wrong. The instant you begin analyzing, consciousness has taken over again, and the channel closes. Just let it be there, and let yourself feel the thing you did not have time to feel, for as long as it takes, which is usually far less time than you feared. That is the entire practice. An older story describes what happens next better than any explanation could. Psyche, set an impossible task, is given an enormous heap of mixed seeds and told to sort them all before morning. It cannot be done. She does not attempt it. She sits down in front of the pile and weeps, and falls asleep. And in the night the ants come, thousands of them, small and organized and entirely uninterested in her opinion, and they sort the seeds while she sleeps. And she wakes to a task completed by something she did not command and could not have performed. This story has been told for 2,000 years, and it is not about ants. Its subject is what is available to a person who stops trying to do by will what can only be done by something deeper, and who is willing to arrive at the pile, look at it honestly, and then let go. Your part is the sitting down in front of the pile. That is not the small part. That is the only part you can do, but it is also not the sorting, and every night you spend trying to do the sorting yourself is a night the ants do not get called. A last note about the nothing. If it lasts for weeks rather than seconds, that is information as well, and it is usually the same information. A person who has spent long enough not feeling things in the moment does not always have a backlog waiting at the door. Sometimes the door has to be located first, which takes longer and looks like failure while it is happening. Keep asking regardless. The question does its work by being asked, not by being answered. Now, one honest warning, because this practice is often abandoned in the second week. Some nights, what surfaces will be heavier than you were expecting. You will ask the question, and what arrives will be substantial, and you will lie there feeling considerably worse than you did before you started. Nothing is failing there. That is a backlog. If a person has spent 15 years not feeling things in the moment, the first few honest nights are not going to be a gentle trickle. There is a queue, and it has been forming for a long time, and the earliest nights are the ones with the most volume. The backlog thins. Reliably and faster than most people expect, because the queue was never infinite. It only felt infinite from behind a closed door. If what arrives is genuinely too large to hold alone, that is not a signal to try harder in the dark. That is a signal that this belongs in daylight, with another person, and that is not a failure of the practice. That is the practice telling you the truth. Here is the last thing about the question, and it explains why it works when nothing else has. The question is not an attempt to improve your state before sleep. It never was. It is an attempt to arrive at sleep as one person instead of two. Because the ordinary way of ending a day splits you. There is the one who lived the day and the one who reports on it, and they do not agree, and you fall asleep with the disagreement unresolved and hand that division over to be rehearsed. The question closes the gap, not by fixing anything, by allowing the person who lived the day to finally be the one who is present at the end of it. One question, perhaps 90 seconds. No result you can measure on the first night, and it will not feel like it is changing your life, because things that change lives almost never feel like it while they are happening. They feel like a small, honest moment in a dark room that nobody else will ever know about. That is what real change has always felt like from the inside. The person you are slowly becoming. One more thing needs saying, and it is why all of this matters beyond sleeping better. Because you could take everything described here as a technique for improving rest, and it would work reasonably well, and you would be missing what is actually happening. What is actually happening is that you are being assembled. Jung had a word for the process, and it is the central idea of his life's work. He called it individuation, and it is worth stating carefully, because it is routinely confused with self-improvement, and it is nearly the opposite. Individuation is not becoming better. It is not becoming more successful, more disciplined, or more impressive. It is the process by which a person gradually becomes the whole of what they actually are, rather than only the portion of themselves that was permitted. Notice the direction of that. It is not addition. It is not the acquisition of new qualities you currently lack. It is retrieval. Everything required is already present. It was present at 11 years old. Most of it was sent downstairs, at various points, for very good reasons at the time, because a household required you to be one kind of person, or a school did, or a marriage did, or a job did. And you complied, sensibly, and you built a life on the compliance, and the parts that did not fit went into the dark and waited. Individuation is going down and getting them, which is why this happens at night, and why it cannot happen any other way. During the day you are required to be the edited version. Only when the requirement lifts does the rest of you have room to come forward. Jung did not observe this from a distance. He went through it, and it nearly took him apart. After his break with Freud, at a point where he was professionally established and personally admired, he entered a period of several years in which the unconscious effectively overwhelmed him. He experienced visions of such intensity that he seriously questioned whether he was becoming ill. He described the ground beneath him giving way. What he chose to do with that period is the reason anyone knows his name. He did not suppress it, and he did not surrender to it. He sat down with it. Night after night, over years, he wrote down what came, and he painted it, and he addressed the figures that appeared in his imagination as though they were entitled to speak. He gave them names, he argued with them, he recorded their replies. Those records became the Red Book, which he did not publish, and which was not released until nearly 50 years after his death. He later said, in effect, that everything he did for the rest of his working life came out of that period. All of the theory, all of the clinical work, all of the writing that outlived him originated in the years he spent going down rather than pushing through. Note how he got there, not by conquering the dark in one heroic night, but by returning to it, night after ordinary night, and staying. That is the actual model. Not a breakthrough, a practice. There is an image that captures this better than any description of progress. A photograph developing in a darkroom. The image is already on the film. It was fixed at the moment the shutter opened. Nothing needs to be added to it, and nothing can be improved about it. But it cannot be seen yet, so it goes into the dark, into a solution, and it is left there. And nothing appears for what feels like an unreasonable length of time. And then, very gradually, the shape begins to emerge, in an order you cannot control, and it becomes what it always was. Two things about that process are exactly true of this one. Nothing about it can be rushed. Agitating the tray does not produce the image faster. It ruins it, and you cannot do it in the light. Not because light is bad, but because the light is what prevented the image from appearing in the first place. You are not being developed into someone else. You are being developed into what was already on the film. An arithmetic objection to all of this deserves an answer before we finish. 90 seconds against 16 hours does not sound like a fair contest. Consciousness spends the entire day laying down the pattern, and here is a practice proposing to redirect it with a minute and a half in the dark. But the two are not doing the same job. 16 hours are spent living. 90 seconds are spent deciding what gets kept. One supplies the material. The other supplies the instruction, and the instruction is delivered at the only hour of the day when nothing is standing in front of it. A person who does not undertake this, Jung believed, simply lives out the unexamined material instead. Not disastrously, usually quite respectably. They repeat their family's patterns with slight variations. They find the same difficulty in each relationship and conclude the difficulty is a coincidence. They arrive at 50 having accumulated a great deal and having met very little. There is a phrase for what such a life feels like, and everyone recognizes it immediately. It feels like time is passing quickly. Time passes quickly when nothing is being received. The changes that come from this practice do not announce themselves. That is worth saying clearly, because people expect a threshold moment and abandon the practice when it does not arrive. You will not wake up transformed. What happens is subtler and considerably more durable. Instead, you notice, months in, that what used to take a whole evening from you now takes 10 minutes. You notice you are less interested in being right in a conversation where you would previously have needed to win. You notice you can be in a room with a feeling without immediately looking for your phone. You notice you are less impressed by people you used to find intimidating and gentler with people you used to find irritating. Nobody around you will identify what changed. Some of them will say you seem calmer, and they will attribute it to sleep or to circumstances easing. Neither of those things happened. What happened is that a person who used to be split into a day version and a hidden version has been quietly becoming one person, 90 seconds at a time, in the dark, for a year. Jung wrote one sentence that is the right place to leave this. He wrote it near the end of a long life, in a book he was reluctant to write, looking back at everything. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. Consider what that sentence does not say. It does not say to escape the darkness. It does not say to explain it, defeat it, or transcend it. It does not promise that the darkness is an illusion or that it will eventually be gone. What it says is that the darkness is where the work is done, and the purpose is not to remove it. The purpose is to bring a light into it, which is a much smaller and much more human thing to be asked to do, and which can be done tonight, by anybody, without preparation. That is what you are doing when you lie down and do not reach for the phone and ask one honest question in a dark room. You are kindling a light in the darkness of mere being. It does not look like anything. It never has. And it is the only thing that has ever actually changed a person. Perhaps by now, something has settled into place. Your life is not being decided in the places you have been watching. It is not being decided by the plans you make in the morning or the effort you produce in the afternoon. Those things matter, but they are the surface. It is being decided at a threshold you cross every night without noticing. In the few minutes when the mask has come off, the day has finished, and you are, briefly, the only person in the room with yourself. Whatever is in you at that moment does not stay behind. It is rehearsed, strengthened, and returned to you wearing the face of tomorrow. And when that has happened for enough years, you stop calling it a pattern. You start calling it your life, and your personality, and the way things are for someone like you. Carl Jung spent 50 years saying that it is none of those things. He did not believe change arrives as a breakthrough. He believed it is a quiet, unglamorous process in which a person gradually stops running from themselves. Every night that you do not reach for the distraction, every night that you stay 30 seconds past comfort, every night that you ask one honest question instead of delivering one more verdict, a piece of you that has been waiting downstairs since childhood is allowed to come up. When enough of you is finally present, life stops repeating. Not because the circumstances changed, because the person meeting them is no longer only a fragment. You do not need to carry anything large across the threshold tonight. Honesty about the feeling that is actually present. Honesty about what you have been rehearsing without noticing. Honesty about the distance between the person you are living as and the person you have not been permitted to be. That is all. And Jung believed that this is what a whole life is built from. Not willpower, not positive thinking, not another plan made at 7 in the morning. If this made you stop somewhere in the middle and think, press like, so it can find the people who are awake right now and need exactly this. And if you want to keep going deeper into the mind, the unconscious, and the long journey back toward yourself, subscribe and stay with us for what comes next. Tonight, when the room goes dark and the day is over, you will arrive at that threshold again. You have arrived at it every night of your life. The only question is whether, this time, you stay in the room long enough to meet the person who is waiting there. Because sometimes, changing one thing before sleep is enough for a whole life to begin turning.